Greetings, Internet. Welcome to the show. So, today we're going to be talking about the geological evidence for the flood. And so, if you go online, if you look up the flood on Wikipedia, it'll say that there's no geological evidence for the flood, that the scientific consensus is that it doesn't exist, it never happened. Maybe there was a local flood that inspired these legends, and that's that. Now, the primary reason for the lack of belief around the flood is actually just the simple fact that in order for there to be a need for a boat or the ark, you need to have the highest mountain peaks covered with water, and in order to do that, you need 8 times the water that is in all of the oceans combined. Where is that water? Where did it come from? So that's the main reason why geologists disbelieve in the flood, because back in the day it was kind of an accepted fact. When archaeology first got started, a lot of the early archaeologists were, I should say both archaeology and geology. So a lot of these early scientists were Christians, and so they knew that there was 500 other cultures that describe a flood myth, and there was evidence for the flood that they saw littering the landscape. So it really wasn't a question. But then when they mapped the depths of the oceans, and they're like, oh wait, there's not enough water on this planet to inundate the tallest mountain peaks. So I guess the flood didn't happen. And but then they needed to explain the geology. And the geological evidence for the flood is actually all the same evidence for the Ice Age, because when they were wondering where all this flood water was, they were noting that some of the geological evidence for the flood appeared near the edges of glaciers. So they're like, oh, maybe the glaciers came down to equatorial regions and there was this Ice Age. And there's so the Ice Age was just kind of shoehorned in to the evidence of the flood. And that's all the same evidence. And we're talking about drumlins. Drumlins are these teardrop-shaped hills. They have like these layers in them, and those were believed to be carved by sheets of ice. And then later, when there was kind of this anomaly of these two different types of drumlins in the same drumlin fields, they came up with the idea that maybe drumlins were not carved by ice; they were actually carved by underwater rivers, like the meltwater underneath the glaciers carved it. There's also these bone caches, like there's these caves and fissures that are filled with animal bones, all strewn about, all broken up, all, no complete skeletons. Those were also believed, maybe this somehow happened with an ice age, but it's not really better explained that way. It's better explained as, is this where bodies collected when the water was drying out from the flood? There's these giant ripple fields, and again, ripples are associated with hydraulic action. They're not necessarily associated with sheets of ice causing, like these vast plains of what looks like ripples. Then there's also debris fields. So there's these giant boulders strewn across areas in Europe. What dropped these boulders? That was thought to be, an iceberg could carry this, or a glacier could carry this and then drop it where we find them. Well, it could be hydraulic action pushing it to their current locations. There is Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated in Mesopotamia. He found there's this famous area called this flood pit, where he's got this 11-foot layer of fine silt that's deposited. That was initially thought to be evidence of the flood, but later it was thought to be just a local flood because it wasn't found at some other locations. But that doesn't really rule out the idea, like the deposits aren't necessarily uniform like that. You don't necessarily get a solid deposit of silt caused by flood. So it could be patchy, and therefore you see it just where he was excavating. Even things like the erosion on the Sphinx. That's a big topic about ancient civilizations, and when was the Sphinx carved? And they usually link that up with when there was rainfall in the area of Egypt. Well, initially that was thought to be the flood caused that erosion. So even things like the Sphinx and the Sphinx Temple complex, that evidence could be evidence of floodwater causing this erosion. There's all now most of that is linked up. Like the flood pit is thought to be a local flood. Now that's the consensus opinion. The erosion of the Sphinx, there's differing opinions of it, but it doesn't really get linked to the flood. But a lot of this evidence gets linked to the Ice Age. And there's one other piece of information. Bone. Oh, I mentioned the bone caches. The scablands and the Grand Canyon are evidence that's thought to be evidence of floodwaters carving that out, as opposed to the scablands is usually explained as an ice dam breaking nearby. The Grand Canyon is thought to be just the effects of a river carving it over millions of years. But the thing with the explanation for the Grand Canyon, so when they do, I don't know if it was carbon dating, but they do some type of like there's a lot of different dating methods, and there's a layer, there was a volcanic explosion that laid down a layer of ash, and that didn't jive with the idea of the Grand Canyon being millions of years old. So there's also with the Grand Canyon, you don't have, like if that was all carved out, you would expect at the mouth of that river this huge delta, right, and all this silt would have all that land that had been carved out should be deposited out at the mouth of the river. It's not. So again, that kind of, there's a lot of evidence against the idea of the common explanations for things. So all of this is evidence for the flood. So it's not really true that when Wikipedia says, "Oh, there's no evidence for this," that's not. There's all it was all originally interpreted. Everything that I've mentioned so far has been originally interpreted as flood evidence for the flood. But there's other explanations for it, and those other explanations are the consensus opinion. Now, the consensus opinion is modern science has an anti-religious bias. So the source of that anti-religious bias, some people think it just goes back to Galileo and the Inquisition and whatnot. They come out of the wars of Reformation in Europe. There was like 200 years after the Protestant Reformation that Europe was just torn apart by these endless wars, these 30-year wars and 80-year wars. And so atheism took a foothold in the scientific community because the people were tired of seeing all these wars due to religion. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that war is intrinsic to religion. Wars are really intrinsic to any, expanding populations. But whoever's in power at that time, and it happened to be, we happened to live in a theocratic world back then where the religious community was essentially also the government, and that caused, through kings and whatnot, the kings were appointed by divine rule, and some kings were Protestants and some kings were Catholics, and so you had this theocratic power structure that was in place at that time. That doesn't necessarily mean religion is warfare is intrinsic to religion itself. Whatever power structure is in play tends to get into war and conflict just because of expanding populations. Humans are we're probably one of the most successful species on the planet. So it's no surprise that our expanding populations cause conflict and war. So anyways, that bias has continued up to this day. Like we still have an atheistic bias in science. They don't like to confirm things about religion. They don't like to confirm the flood. But this is part of our collective history. The flood is literally in 500 different cultures around the world minimum. It's part of our biblical history. That's 4 billion people. Genesis describes the flood that 4 billion people have that as the foundation of the religion, whether Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. So it's part of the world's collective history, this idea of the flood, and there is tons of evidence for it, and most of the Ice Age evidence is better explained as a flood. And I've made another video called Is the Ice Age Just a Myth, that kind of gets into that angle a little bit more. And yeah, so there's all this evidence for the flood. It's just has other explanations, and those other explanations are consensus, but that's probably not. It's probably the result of the anti-religious bias of modern science. Anyways, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and jump down in the comments if you want to say something. Thanks. See you next time.